Story 1. On New Year's Eve, me, Jake, and my friends Ethan and Mike decided to celebrate in downtown Chicago, specifically in the River North area, where the streets were packed with excited people, lights shining everywhere, and that party vibe in the air. We had just left a bar on Hubbard Street, laughing and discussing our next destination, when a somewhat out-of-breath man approached us. He seemed agitated, looking around as if he were being chased. He said something like, "Someone just stole my cell phone. Please let me use yours. I need to call the bank before they do anything with my details." At the time, I was a little suspicious, but his desperate manner convinced me. He looked to be in his early 30s, dressed in a shabby jacket that didn't quite fit in with the party atmosphere around us. Ethan was the first to take out his cell phone, but before handing it over, he asked, "Are you sure you didn't see where they went? Maybe we can help." Meanwhile, I noticed that some other people started to approach. An older man waved at us, saying he had seen someone running in the opposite direction, and a woman bumped into me, saying, "Sorry, it's really crowded here, isn't it?" That's when things started to feel strange. As Ethan tried to understand what the man was saying, everything became confusing. The woman who had bumped into me was still nearby, almost glued to my shoulder, as if she wanted to hear the conversation. The older man who indicated a direction kept insisting, "They went that way. If you're quick, you can still catch it." Mike, always more suspicious, started poking me and whispered, "This looks weird. Are you feeling it too?" Before I could respond, I felt something strange in my coat pocket. When I looked down, I saw that my wallet was no longer there. My heart raced. At the same time, Ethan finally handed the guy his cell phone. The man started to dial a number, but instead of calling, he looked at us, said a quick "thank you," and disappeared into the crowd. When Ethan realized it, it was too late. His cell phone was also gone. Mike began frantically checking his pockets and realized that the watch he had taken off his wrist to keep was missing. We were surrounded by people laughing and celebrating the new year, but it was as if a hole had opened up around us. No one seemed to notice what had happened to us. We stood there for a moment, half responsive. It was as if everything around us was happening in slow motion, and we were stuck in the most absurd part of this night. Mike began swearing under his breath, more to himself than to us, while Ethan shook his head as if trying to wake up from a bad dream. I tried to get the attention of some people nearby, but everyone was so focused on counting the minutes until midnight that they didn't even look at us properly. That's when I realized that the woman who had bumped into me wasn't there anymore either. "They planned this right, man," Mike said, with an expression of pure hatred. Without our cell phones and with Mike without his wallet, we decided to go back the same way to see if we could find a police officer or someone who could help. It seemed like a good idea at the time, but the further we got away from the main movement, the darker and emptier everything became. The streets started to look different. Some lights were off, and the people we met no longer had that festive atmosphere. Some were looking at us from top to bottom, and I swear I heard someone whispering something as we passed by. That's when I realized how helpless we were. No money, no cell phone, no idea where to turn for help. Everything started to seem darker. I think the worst part was when we realized we were literally lost. The streets didn't look the same as before. The music and celebratory screams became more distant until they disappeared completely. Mike, who was trying to remain calm, suggested that we continue straight, but everything seemed like a maze. The facades of the buildings were dark, as if the entire neighborhood had suddenly been abandoned. "That doesn't make sense." "We were 2 blocks from Hubbard," Ethan said, looking around, clearly trying to convince himself. But I knew something was wrong. It wasn't just the place. It was the way everything seemed to watch us. When we finally spotted an alley lit by a flashing neon light, we thought it would be our chance to head back to some main street. But as soon as we got closer, we saw 2 men leaning against the wall, smoking. They stared at us without saying anything, just watching as we passed by. Their silence was unsettling, almost threatening. When we were almost out of the alley, I heard footsteps behind us. My heart sank. I didn't want to look, but it was impossible to ignore. When I turned around, I saw that it wasn't just the two men. A few more people had appeared, and they were all looking at us, standing still, as if waiting for something. The tension was unbearable. Nobody said anything, but the way they looked at us was worse than any words. "Let's keep walking." Without looking back, I whispered, trying to sound confident but feeling my stomach drop. Ethan and Mike nodded, and we moved on, trying to appear as nonchalant as possible. But as we advanced, the footsteps behind us continued, slow, as if to remind us that we were not alone. When we finally left the alley, we came face to face with another almost deserted street. No bars, no open shops, just a few lampposts flickering faintly. That's when I realized I could no longer pretend that this was just bad luck. Something was very wrong. That's when we heard a low laugh coming from somewhere nearby. It was barely a whisper, but it echoed in a way that made my skin crawl. Mike stopped and looked around, holding my arm tightly. "You heard that, right?" He didn't even need to ask. The sound seemed to be everywhere at once. I looked at Ethan, who was pale, and noticed that he was holding something in his pockets as if it were a reflection. But there was nothing there. "We need to get out of here now," he said, his voice shaking. And that's what we tried to do, but every corner we turned seemed to take us back to some familiar place, as if we were trapped. The feeling of being trapped in a loop was suffocating. We turned a corner and it felt like we were back in the same place, even though that was impossible. Even the air felt different, heavy, difficult to breathe. Suddenly, Ethan stopped in the middle of the sidewalk and started fumbling with his jacket as if he was looking for something. "My key," he muttered, almost panicking. "I had put it in here." We hadn't realized it before, but they had taken everything, even the most insignificant things. It was as if every detail was planned. "This isn't just a robbery," Mike whispered, looking around as if expecting to see someone watching us. "It's like they want us to be right here." And then something happened that made me question everything. A streetlight in front of us began to blink frantically until it burned out completely, plunging that part of the street into darkness. It was at that exact moment that we heard faster footsteps, as if someone was running towards us. Ethan shouted, "Run!" And without thinking, we started running as fast as we could, without even knowing where we were going. I could hear my own breathing and the sound of footsteps getting closer and closer. When I looked back, for a second, I didn't see anyone, just the empty street. But the feeling that something was right behind me wouldn't go away. Running without stopping, we finally saw a busier avenue. Felt like an oasis after that nightmare. There were cars passing by, people walking, and even the lighting seemed brighter. We arrived there panting, practically throwing ourselves onto the sidewalk. A man selling street food looked at us curiously, as if we were exaggerating, but none of us could explain what had happened. I tried to organize my thoughts, but the pieces didn't fit together. How did we get out of that place so suddenly? Mike pointed to a digital clock in a nearby store and said something that gave me goosebumps. "It's 2:15, we had wasted almost 2 hours, but we swore it all happened in less than 30 minutes. We tried to tell the salesman what happened, but he just laughed, shaking his head. "You guys were probably robbed and you're exaggerating. This is Chicago, it happens all the time," he said, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. But we knew it wasn't just that. We didn't talk much after that. We managed to catch a ride with a driver who was parked on the avenue and, in silence, we returned to Ethan's apartment. That feeling of being followed didn't go away until we were locked inside. To this day, none of us can explain exactly what happened. It wasn't just a robbery. Something or someone threw us into that situation and let us escape, but I don't know why. I never went out to celebrate New Year after that. If you like our stories, leave a comment and subscribe to the channel. Story 2. It was New Year's Eve, and I was returning home after spending the day at my parents' house. The road was quiet, only the occasional car passed by, and I thought that was good. After so much noise and people talking at the same time, that silence was a relief. I lived about 2 hours away, so the trip was a bit long, but I was used to it. I remember that I was listening to music on the radio, distracted, when I noticed that the car started to make a strange noise, like a creak mixed with a pop. The steering wheel also felt a little heavy, as if something was wrong. My stomach sank because that road wasn't exactly the best place to have mechanical problems. Luckily, or unluckily, as I realized later, I saw a gas station ahead. It was small, the kind you only see in movies, with a flashing neon light and a somewhat abandoned look. Still, I stopped the car. There wasn't much to do, right? Inside, there was only one attendant behind the counter and a man leaning against one side of the station, smoking. He looked in his early 40s with grease-stained clothes. As soon as I got out of the car, he approached, asking if I needed help. At first I was suspicious, but he seemed to know what he was doing, and I was desperate. He looked at the engine, touched a few things, and then said it was fixed. It was just a loose cable, he explained, smiling. I thanked him and even offered money, but he refused, saying that helping doesn't cost anything. I got back in the car, feeling a little calmer, but something still didn't feel right. He seemed to be on top of everything, as if he was familiar with that station and with road cars, but I couldn't help but feel a shiver run down my spine. I started the car and started heading down the road again. However, after a few kilometers, the car started to fail again, but this time it was much worse. The engine died completely, and the dashboard light came on as if the car had died for good. I couldn't believe this was happening. It was late, and the place was even more isolated. I looked in the rearview mirror and, to my surprise, the man was there again on his motorcycle with the same silent expression as before. My heart raced, and the feeling that something was very wrong grew. He stopped next to me and asked if I needed help, saying there was something he could try to do. I tried not to show panic, but my voice was shaking when I responded. He said there was no problem and asked me to open the hood again. What he did was quick, without saying much, but this time, when he looked at me, his eyes were different. I don't know exactly how to describe it, but his look was no longer helpful. It seemed much more calculated, as if he knew exactly what he was doing and I was no longer a problem to be solved, but rather an opportunity. He spent more time than necessary fiddling with the parts, and soon I realized that the noise of the motorcycle, previously distant, was now much closer. Something in me screamed not to trust him, but I was stuck, not knowing what to do. When he finally finished and walked away, saying the car was ready to go, something inside me didn't calm down. I was almost paralyzed, feeling like I was about to make the worst choice of my life. I don't know how to explain it, but it felt like I was being watched, not just by him, but by something else, as if I were at the center of a trap that I was helping to build. Still, without many options, I started the car, and to my surprise, it started without any difficulties. I started driving faster, trying to get away from that gas station as quickly as possible, but I soon realized that he was following me. I even looked in the rearview mirror and saw the light of the motorcycle behind me. What once seemed like a simple coincidence was now turning into something much more sinister. Fear took hold of me, and with every mile that passed, it got closer. I don't know if he was speeding up or if the car was starting to fail again, but the feeling of being chased paralyzed me. I tried to remain calm, but I couldn't. My breathing was labored, and my hands were sweating. When I entered a part of the road where there were no more streetlights, Only the car and motorcycle headlights illuminated the total darkness. It was at that moment that the car stopped again, and I knew it was too late. He was so close, and I could hear the sound of the motorcycle approaching. It was dark. There was no one else around, and my heart was about to come out of my mouth. I didn't know what to do. That man was no longer trying to help me. He seemed to have disappeared any trace of kindness. I looked to the side and saw that he was already standing right next to me, not bothering to hide his presence. He was no longer smiling, nor speaking, just watching with an intense gaze. I couldn't think straight anymore. What did he want? He wanted me to stay there, scared, stuck on that deserted road. I felt a tension in the air, a pressure that made me want to scream, but the words wouldn't come out. Then, suddenly, the man approached the car with the same disturbing calm. He said his help wasn't over, as if he was joking with me. Something in me knew this was no longer about a car repair, but about his control over the situation. My survival instinct kicked in. I don't remember how, but somehow I managed to start the car without even realizing it. I started to accelerate without looking back. The noise of the motorcycle was still nearby, but I could only think of one thing: getting out of there. The streets began to become even more desolate, with only a few bushes on the side of the road. Fear consumed me so intensely that I no longer saw the road properly. Only the sound of the motorcycle accelerating behind me echoed in my mind. When I looked in the rearview mirror again, the man was much further away, which, in a moment of relief, made me take a deep breath. But still, my heart was racing. The relief didn't last, because something inside me knew the worst was yet to come. My mind was so alert that I almost didn't notice the unexpected turn in the road. I was panicking, my stomach was churning, and it was at that moment that the car stopped again. It wasn't like last time where he just failed. This time, the engine shut off all at once, without warning. Everything went silent, and what once seemed like a simple mechanical failure turned into a real nightmare. I was paralyzed. The car was in the middle of nowhere, the dark of the night swallowing me, and the only thing I could hear was my heavy breathing. I looked around and saw, with a shiver down my spine, the motorcycle returning at high speed. The man was coming, but this time there was something different in the air. He seemed more determined, more threatening, as if the chase was no longer about the car but about me. With every second that passed, he got closer. My body could no longer think straight, but fear drove me to open the car door and run, even though I didn't know where. I just wanted away from him, no matter where, but I couldn't. Before I could leave, he was already at my side, with an unusual calmness, as if he had been watching me for days, studying my every move. There was no longer any rush in his gaze. He spoke again, but his words were no longer an offer of help. He said he was having fun, as if it was all a game to him. I couldn't react immediately. Terror took over me. I just knew I needed to escape, but the fear of looking at him prevented me from acting. I was paralyzed, unable to think about anything other than how he was there, next to me, and how I didn't know what else to do. That's when the motorcycle's light suddenly went out. The man stopped and stood there, facing the car, but without moving, as if he was waiting for something. It was a surreal scene, almost like a nightmare in which you try to scream, but your voice won't come out. The road was silent again. The noise of the motorcycle had disappeared, and I sat there motionless, not understanding what was happening. He no longer moved, but he didn't seem to move away either. The fear began to turn into mental confusion. I looked ahead, trying to find a way out, but the darkness seemed to swallow me, and I no longer knew if he was there or if he was gone. I turned to look, and when I looked again, he was just not there anymore. Suddenly, as if he had never existed, the man disappeared, and the motorcycle was no longer in sight. I couldn't process what happened. The car was still broken, but somehow the fear was no longer the same. I was alone, but at the same time, something inside me felt that his presence was still there, invisible. I looked around, confused, feeling an indescribable emptiness. After a few minutes that seemed like an eternity, I managed to start the car again, and the journey continued. I didn't know what exactly had happened, whether it was something real or a hallucination caused by fear. All I know is that I never went back to that road again. To this day, I can't explain what happened. And the worst thing is that, no matter how much I try to understand, I can't forget those eyes, that silence, and the feeling that he's still watching me, somehow. If you like our stories, leave a comment and subscribe to the channel. Story 3. A young man traveling home on New Year's Eve decides to stop at a remote motel after driving along long country roads. The manager is overly friendly, but the place feels eerily empty. That night, strange sounds echo through the walls, and he notices someone watching his room in the dark parking lot. I'll start with the first 2 paragraphs of the report, maintaining the first-person perspective and the requested informal tone. I've never told this story to anyone other than my family, but after 3 years I still can't stop thinking about what happened that New Year's Eve in Wyoming. I was returning from Denver to my hometown in Montana after spending Christmas with some friends. It was December 30th, and it was already past 9 p.m. when I realized I couldn't handle driving any longer. It had been snowing all day and the roads were a nightmare, especially on I-25 North. My cell phone signal had been fluctuating since I passed through Casper, and the GPS kept losing connection. After almost 2 hours without seeing any gas stations or decent places to stop, I finally saw a faded Pine Grove Motel sign. At that moment, any place would do. I just wanted to rest for a few hours and be on my way before New Year's Eve. The motel was about 200 meters down a side road, and as I got closer, I started to feel a strange sensation. The place seemed stuck in time, with those old neon signs flashing erratically and typical 70s construction. The parking lot was practically empty except for an old pickup truck and a van. When I entered the reception, a guy who must have been in his 60s jumped out of his chair with a huge smile, as if he had been waiting for me for hours. He introduced himself as Doug and started babbling about how lucky I was because it was the best room in the house and it was rarely available. I thought it was a bit strange, since the place looked like flies, but I was too tired to question it. I paid $45 in cash, got the key to room 14, and headed to the parking lot, trying to ignore the way Doug was watching me through the reception window. I remember that as soon as I entered the room, the first thing that bothered me was the smell. A mixture of mold and something that I still can't describe to this day, kind of metallic. The decor looked like it hadn't been updated since the motel was built, with that typical 70s carpet and an old TV that barely worked. I threw my backpack on the bed and went straight to the bathroom to take a hot shower. The bathroom was small and had a small tilting window that looked out onto the parking lot. As the shower heated up, I started to hear strange noises coming from the walls, as if someone was dragging something heavy in the next room. But it was impossible, because I was sure I hadn't seen any cars parked near my room when I arrived. I left the shower feeling even more restless than when I arrived. The noises had stopped, but now I could hear footsteps outside in the snow. There were slow steps, as if someone was walking in circles. I turned off all the lights in the room and went to the window, pulling the curtain back a little to see what was happening. That's when I saw a figure standing in the middle of the parking lot, right under the blinking streetlight. It was a tall man, wearing a dark coat, and he was completely still, looking directly at my window. My heart sank when I realized it wasn't Doug from reception. This person was much taller and broader. The worst thing is that even with the distance, I was absolutely sure he knew I was there, watching back. In a matter of seconds, thousands of thoughts ran through my head. I thought about grabbing my things and running out to the car, but what if there was someone else outside? I thought about calling the police, but the cell phone signal was still terrible, just a wavering bar. I tried to convince myself that I was exaggerating, that I was probably just another guest at the motel. But why would he be standing there in the cold, staring at me? I decided to lock the bathroom door and the main door with all available locks. When I returned to the window, the figure had disappeared. I searched the entire parking lot with my eyes, but I couldn't find him. The silence was absolute, except for the sound of the wind hitting the tree branches around the motel. It was then that I started to hear something that made my blood run cold. It was a low sound, almost imperceptible at first, coming from somewhere inside the room itself. It sounded like a hiss, like heavy, irregular breathing that got louder and louder. The worst part was that I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from exactly. Sometimes it seemed to be coming from the walls, sometimes the ceiling, sometimes from under the bed. I leaned against a corner of the room, holding my cell phone tightly, even though I knew it wouldn't be of much use. The hissing began to turn into a kind of hum, and along with it, the sounds of something being dragged returned. But now they seemed to be coming from all sides. It was as if the entire room was alive, pulsing with those sounds. Suddenly, I heard 3 loud knocks on the door, which made me jump in fright. They weren't normal knocks. They were slow and rhythmic, as if someone was trying to establish some kind of communication. I was paralyzed, not knowing what to do. After a few seconds that seemed like an eternity, I heard Doug's voice. "Is everything okay there, son?" I thought I heard some noises, but there was something wrong with his voice. It sounded distorted, as if he were speaking through an interference radio. I didn't respond. The knocking began again, louder this time, and the doorknob began to turn violently. "I need to check if everything is okay in there. It's motel policy." The voice continued, but now it didn't sound at all like Doug, who had greeted me at reception. Panic took over me when I realized that the door was starting to give way, even with all the locks. The hinges creaked under the impact of something much stronger than normal knocks. It was at that moment that I saw out the window that the pickup and van that had been in the parking lot had completely disappeared. There were no cars left other than my Ford Fusion. The humming in the walls had turned into a low, pulsing sound that made the entire room vibrate. Through the curtain, I could see more dark figures gathering in the parking lot, all standing still, all facing toward my window. There must have been 6 or 7 of them now, perfectly still in the snow that continued to fall. That's when I noticed the temperature in the room had suddenly plummeted. I could see my own breath in the air. The knocking on the door stopped abruptly, and for a moment I thought it was all over. But then I started hearing a sound that haunts me in nightmares to this day. It was footsteps, dozens of them, synchronized, moving in circles around the room. It was as if several people were marching outside, but the footsteps seemed to be everywhere at once. The scary thing is that even with all the noise, I could still see the figures in the parking lot, completely still. How could they be standing there and at the same time walking around the room? My body was shaking uncontrollably, partly from the intense cold, partly from the absolute terror I was feeling. On a desperate impulse, I grabbed my backpack and car keys and got ready to run. It no longer mattered if there was something waiting for me outside. I needed to try to escape from that place. But when I placed my hand on the door handle, all sounds instantly stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I opened the door quickly and ran to the car without looking back. Only when I was on the road, driving at more than 100 per hour, did I realize the motel had completely disappeared from the rearview mirror. Where the neon sign should have been, there was only darkness and an empty road. I drove all night without stopping, and I could never find that place or any record of it on the internet again. Sometimes I wonder if it was all just a hallucination caused by exhaustion, but the frozen handprints that remained on my hotel room door the next night prove it was real. I've spent the last 3 years trying to find some rational explanation for everything that happened that night. I researched the history of the region. I looked for old records of motels in that area of Wyoming. I tried to find other people who had already experienced something similar. I even made a few trips back to that road, always during the day, trying to locate any trace of the Pine Grove Motel. But it's as if he never existed. The only thing I found was an old newspaper article talking about the unexplained disappearance of 7 people in that area during the winter of 1977. The article mentioned that they had all been last seen traveling alone on I-25 North, but the bodies were never seen, were found. These days, I avoid driving at night whenever possible, especially on deserted roads. When there is no other way and I need to do it, I feel my heart skip a beat every time I see a motel sign on the side of the road. The worst thing is that since that night, whenever it's very cold and quiet, I start to hear that same low humming sound, as if the walls were alive again. And sometimes, when I look in the rearview mirror while driving at night, I think I see a tall figure in a dark coat standing on the side of the road, watching me pass by. I never stop to check if it's real. Some things are better not to know, and whatever was in that motel that New Year's Eve, I'm sure it's still out there, waiting for the next solo traveler who decides to stop for a rest.